introduce Dr. Hedley Twidle, a newly appointed associate professor, newly promoted associate professor. He's a writer and researcher based in the Department of English Literary Studies here at UCT, where he's also the winner of our UCT Distinguished Teacher Award. His speciality is the 20th century, Southern African and world literatures, as well as creative non-fiction and the environmental humanities. He's written regularly for publications like the Financial Times and New Statesman, and was indeed the 2012 winner of the inaugural Bodley Head Financial Times essay competition for his piece, Getting Past Coetzee. His essay collection, Firepool, Experiences in an Abnormal World, was published by Quella in 2017, and his most recent book, Experiments with Truth, is a study of narrative non-fiction and the South African transition, which appeared in the African Articulation series from James Curry last year. So welcome, Hedley, and thank you for...
Thank you, everyone. Welcome. My name is Hedley Twidle, and I suppose that's quite a good place to start because, you know, we don't choose our own names. And this piece of language that gets attached to us, probably the most influential piece of language that gets attached to us in our lives, we have no say in. And I often wonder why my parents went for not just an unusual surname, but an unusual first name as well. And I wonder what it would have been like if I'd been called Dirk or Kevin or something, which is kind of very hard to see. It's almost like the blind spot at the back of your retina. You know, what is the relationship between the proper noun, your name, in my case it's Hedley, and the pronoun I? What's the relation between those two things? That is really what we're going to be looking at in this lecture series as I explore a whole galaxy of different kinds of writing that intersect with and represent and sometimes play with and mess around with concepts of autobiography, personal narrative, memoir, life writing, and all other kinds of writing that are sort of focused through and unfold through the I. But whether that I is identical with the proper noun of the author is a whole nother question, which I hope we're going to think about in interesting ways. I did send out some readings for you. I did get some emails that people struggled to download some of them. I'm not sure. I will try again. It was fine. Some people said it was fine. Okay. It's not essential that you read them. As a lecturer to undergraduates, I'm very well prepared for lecturing to people who haven't read the readings. It's generally my sort of de facto position. But I think if you have managed to glance at some of them prior to the lectures, it would help. And I've certainly selected things and readings and essays that have meant a lot to me. So what I hope to do is, in the first lecture, this lecture, maybe it'll spill over into the second, it will be a more conceptual sort of introduction to what is autobiography. And then as we move through the week, I will start concentrating very closely on specific essays and readings. So if it's all a bit much today and all a bit all over the place, please don't worry, or just stay with it, because I will come back to these ideas as I read the essays and sort of bed them down in actual applied reading and examples. I want to, as I said, trace the kind of many different kinds of writing that come under this very useless label, non-fiction, which is like calling all your clothes non-socks. I mean, most pieces of writing in the world are non-fictional. But we apprehend them through a non, which I've never really liked. And when I was at school, we studied novels, we studied poems, we studied plays, and so on. But no one ever really said, well, let's study a personal essay as a piece of art, as a work of art. Let's study a biography as a work of art, which of course it is. It's more committed to the so-called real world. It's more committed to the actual. But it's still an exercise in making aesthetic choices, in choosing ways of telling a story, in deciding what kind of plot you're going to. Even if you're writing a biography, I was recently writing about Mark Clovis's enormous biography of Thabo Mbeki. He makes a huge amount of aesthetic choices in that biography. He chooses metaphors. He talks about his subject via Shakespeare's Coriolanus. It's a very, there are decisions around aesthetics and how to write that are equal to, I think, the kinds of decisions that go into writing novels or writing poems, though they're of a different kind. So, but the thing is, I think often when people read nonfiction, well, I notice this with my students, they tend to just read it for information, as if at the other side of the language there's just information that they're going to get from the nonfiction, which I suppose is a very common sense way to read, and most of the time we are just reading for information if we're reading Wikipedia pages or tax returns. But one of the sort of key insights of my discipline, literary studies, is that language doesn't just reflect the world or sort of give us a transparent window onto the world. It in effect creates the world. We apprehend the world through language, and language in a very deep sense governs what can be thought and the horizons of our consciousness. We are linguistic beings, and indeed the coming into language at about 3 or 4 years old is very intertwined with the formation of memory. So the constellation of language, memory, autobiography, I find it a very resonant one. And I want to move, and I will move in the third lecture, to that neurological idea of memory and forgetting. When I was 18, my mother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, early onset. And there were many things I wish I'd known and read before she went through that ordeal. And in a sense, often when I give these lectures, I'm giving them to undergraduate students as a sense of, this is the archive of what people have written about memory and what happens when memory is damaged or corrupted, and how it allows us to see some extraordinarily powerful and radical things about what personality is, what personhood is. So that's what we'll move to in the third lecture. And then in the final lectures, we'll be looking at narratives of coming of age and education, both formal and informal. And so the lectures will touch on various aspects of a human life, accounts of childhood, family, and growing up, in the writing of Rustam Kozain, a wonderful essay called Dacha, about growing up in Nepal. Rustam is a great poet, but this is a prose piece. There are coming-of-age stories, narratives of education and intellectual formation, which, the German word Bildung is used. The word Bildungsroman is a novel of formation, a novel of education, and we'll see that in Joan Didion, Goodbye to All That. We'll see it in Ta-Nehisi Coates's wonderful portrait of being at Howard College in Washington, D.C. So if there's a few things I really want to do, I want to think, as I said, about the poetics of autobiography and nonfiction and life writing. How is it written? Why has the writer made these choices? How is it narrated? I want us to complicate ideas of sincerity and authenticity. What I mean by that, I think in the moment we're in, a great premium is placed on the idea of being sincere and being authentic and being real and telling my truth. This is my truth. From my rather more skeptical discipline, it's not quite so simple. Because if we're reading an autobiography or we're reading an op-ed, what makes us think that something's sincere or not? I mean, if we're reading something in the absence of the writer, where does the effect of sincerity come from? Where does the effect of something feeling genuine come from, or feeling authentic come from? So, tomorrow I'll touch on Adrian Leftwich's extraordinary essay, I Gave the Names, about betraying his comrades during the struggle. And he tries at a great distance, after many years of silence and reckoning, to understand, why did I do what I did? And that essay was read by some people as deeply sincere and deeply convincing, and by other people as, deeply insincere and unbelievable, not credible, not plausible. So what are we talking about when we address those kinds of things? And if there's one thing if there's one thing I really want you to walk away from this lecture with, is a more complicated idea of this very small word, I, in the language. Such a natural word, comes so easily to the lips, but this question, which I get a lot from students, kind of isolates the problem, because can I use I in my essays? The first I is me. It's the wonderful, irreplaceable me, like a snowflake. But the second I is a pronoun. It's a language, it's a piece of language. It's a one-letter word that we all use all the time, but everyone uses it. You all use I. So this is the sort of paradox that as we enter language, we start having to use the same linguistic tokens. Can I use I in my essays? The gap between the authentic, sincere, personal I and the linguistic pronoun, textual I is key. I want to drive a kind of wedge between those two, so that we start looking very carefully at pronouns, because pronouns are the shortest words in the language, but they really are the most complex. I think they're called shifters by linguists because they're constantly shifting. I will also, my I is to you as your I is to me. They're always shifting they're like those particles that we learned about at school. Are they called highly covalent? They bond with all kinds of things all the time, and they change their allegiances. And all kinds of social and political weight attached to pronouns. So I'm going to be reading for those as we go through the pieces. So this is the first lecture. What is autobiography? First person singular, I. What is this thing called autobiography? All the artwork is by Robin Rode, just to note. And I want to just to start with this poem by a man called Coetzee. He's a sort of strange figure in South African literature. He was around in the 60s and 70s. He wrote a lot of avant-garde, quite strange poems, and then he just disappeared. I mean, he literally disappeared. No one knew what happened to him. He did have a history of mental illness and possible schizophrenia. But he wrote these unusual poems, and I'll just read a bit. I was born 26 July 1939 in Ventersdorp. I found myself in a situation. I was born 26 July 1939 in Sophiatown. I found myself in a situation. I was born 26 July 1939 in District 6. I found myself in a situation. I was born 26 July 1939 in Velkom. I found myself in a situation. Now, when my mind started to tick, I noticed other humans like me, shaped like me, ears, eyes, hair, legs, arms, etc. I checked. We are all cast in the same shackles, flesh, mind, feeling, smell, sight, etc. Date today is 5 April 1975. I live at 23 Mountain Drive, Adelaide Woods, phone number 821646, post box 26285. I still find myself in this situation. I possess a typewriter and paper. I possess tools to profess I am artist. I possess books, clothes to dress, my flesh, my fingerprint of identity. I do not possess this land, a car, much cash, or other valuables. I brought 3 kids into this world, as far as I know. I prefer a private to a public life, I feel allowed to say. I suffer from schizophrenia, they tell me. I'll die, I suppose, of lung cancer, if I read the ads correctly. I hope to live to the age of 60. I hope to leave some evidence that I inhabited this world, that I sensed my situation, that I created something out of my situation, out of my life, that I lived as human, alive, I died 26 July 1999 on the Costa del Sol. I found myself in a situation. I died 26 July 1999 in the grasslands. I found myself in a situation. I died 26 July 1999 in the Kalahari. I found myself in a situation. I died 26 July 1999 in an argument. I found myself in a situation. Yeah. It's one of those poems, I don't know why it fascinates me, I don't really know what it's about, but it's just stuck in my head for years and years and years.
Why is it a poem?
Why is it a poem?
Yes.
Why not? It's got lots of white space around it. That's always a giveaway. It's like, well, this is this is sort of concrete poetry, isn't it? Where you make a shape on the page, a geometric shape, and it's going down, it's winnowing itself down to I, and the I is knocked down from the caps, which, and if you think about it, English is quite unusual in having the I as capitalized. Most other languages, whether it's ek or die, je, it's not capitalized. So he's already trying to make it look a bit stranger than it is. You know, Kafka said the more you look at words, the more strangely they look back at you. And I think he's doing something about that. But this situation, what is the situation he's talking about? Well, you know, in 1950s Johannesburg, a situation was a slang word for middle class black people who'd been educated, who spoke English, and who could apply for jobs in town in the situation vacant ads. So to be a situation was to be in this sort of in-between space between many of the people who lived in Sophiatown and the world of power and money. So there's definitely that. There's a South African situation, and I mean, you know, to be born in South Africa is to be born into a situation, for sure. Again, none of us really asked to be born, but the situation is more generally an existential situation. And I suppose this is, firstly, what autobiography is doing, reckoning with the world, the situation that we find ourselves thrown into. Who am I? Where am I? What am I doing here? What kind of person am I? Why did I do what I did? How did I become who I am? Which is part of what autobiography tries to answer. Am I the same as I once was? What situation do I find myself in? A family situation, a local situation, a national situation, a global situation. Here is Kierkegaard giving a wonderful summation of this, really one of my favorite passages. You stick your finger into the ground to smell what country you're in. I stick my finger into existence and there's no smell at all. Where am I? What is that supposed to mean in the world? What does the word mean? Who has lured me into all this and left me standing here? Who am I? How did I get into the world? Why was I never asked? Why was I not taught the rules and customs here, but just stuck into the ranks as though I'd been bought from some traveling slave trader? How come I am a participant in this huge enterprise known as reality? Why should I be a participant? Is there no choice in the matter? And if there is no choice, then where is the manager? There's something I want to say to him. Is there no manager? Then to whom shall I address my complaint? So the first, this lecture and the next, I want to make 4 propositions or claims about autobiography that are not, they're there to be argued with, but they're ideas. The first is that everything is autobiographical. And in a sense, everything is autobiographical, isn't it? From the earliest cave art in Lascaux or on the rocks of southern Africa where we get hand stencils, it's someone leaving a mark, saying, I was here. The desire to grapple with the riddles of human existence permeates human symbolic expression throughout the world. We're always writing, we're making notes, we're making marks, now digital marks, keystrokes. Is that to be seen as our autobiography? Every mark we make, actual and symbolic. Borges, the Argentinian writer, Borges has got a lovely paragraph on this, very, it's like a parable, like much of his writing, where just an afterword to a selection of prose, he says, a man sets himself the task of depicting the world. Year after year, he fills the space with images of provinces, kingdoms, mountains, bays, ships, islands, fishes, rooms, instruments, stars, horses, and people. Just before he dies, he discovers that out of this patient labyrinth of lines emerge the features of his own face. Borges, great writer for the list, and also always his writing is always permeated by labyrinths and strange ways of understanding the riddles of experience. This idea that you try to depict the whole world, and just at the end of your life you realize that it makes up a portrait of yourself, of your own face. It makes me think also of those portraits that are now made from thousands of little photographs, which then produce an image when you view them from a greater distance. So everything is autobiographical. Is it? Well, maybe. It doesn't really help us all that much. James Coetzee sort of refining this idea a bit. I made me laugh at Fanua that talked about this piece I wrote called Getting Past Coetzee, because I obviously haven't got past Coetzee. There's a lot in this lecture series on him. He was, of course, at this university. He wrote very brilliantly on autobiography. His inaugural lecture was called Truth in Autobiography, which I sent you. When you become a professor, you give a lecture which is supposed to condense your scholarship. And he chose to speak about truth and autobiography. And I can still see all the books he ordered in the library. I can tell there's a shadow there in the library. Not a shadow, but there's a presence there. He ordered a lot of books around this. So this is an amazing book, doubling the point. It's a book of essays, but also interviews with David Atwell, and not any usual interviews. These interviews were conducted by mail. So David would type his questions and post them in obs, and then Coetzee would pick them up and write them down and repost them. So they were sort of long form interviews, and I've always found it as one of the most amazing meditations on creative process. And this is how he starts. He asks about the strange quality of Coetzee's work that seems so impersonal but so deeply personal at the same time. And he says, let me treat this as a question about telling the truth rather than a question about autobiography. Because in a larger sense, all writing is autobiography. Everything that you write, including criticism and fiction, writes you as you write it. The real question, the massive autobiographical enterprise that fills a life, this enterprise of self-construction, does it yield only fictions? Or rather, among the fictions of the self, the versions of the self that it yields, are there any that are truer than others? How do I know when I have the truth about myself? And this question is one that will go throughout his criticism. How do I know when I have arrived at the truth about myself in a secular world, for example? How do I know that I've got to the truth about myself? How do I know that I'm not deluding myself? And then he goes on, to talk about how questions of fact don't really capture the issue, because what is truth to fact? You tell the story of your life by selecting from a reservoir of memories, and in the process of selecting you leave things out. To admit to say that you tortured flies as a child is, logically speaking, as much an infraction of truth to say that you tortured flies when in fact you didn't. You could see a line right. If you don't say that you tortured flies as a child, it's almost as bad to say that you tortured them when you didn't. So, the question of facts doesn't get us very far with nonfiction, because there are too many facts. Facts would fill endless books in a kind of Borgesian way. So what facts are selected when we tell the story of our own life? Okay, so this is the first proposition. Everything's autobiographical, but it doesn't really help us. It's a bit vague, it's a bit existential. It's not something you can really grapple with. So let me try the second one. Autobiography is a word. Okay, autobiography is but a word. So what does the word autobiography do? Well, people generally look things up online, first of all, which I guess is where we go to. But often, better archives. But this Google tells us an account of a person's life written by that person. Wikipedia, an autobiography from the Greek, auto, self. Of course, there's many auto words in the English language. Automatic, self-driving, bios, life, graphing, to write, but also to make a mark, so graffiti, graphics. There's a self-written account of the life of oneself, the biography of oneself, narrated by oneself. They always have this circularity. It's like a Mobius strip. But the interesting thing to me when I did look up on Google is that the word autobiography obviously didn't always exist. It only came into existence at a certain moment, which is the end of the 18th century. So, we have to historicize the question of autobiography. And that's why I always tell students, don't go to Google, go to the Oxford English Dictionary, because they give you a history of usages. And you can see when the word first comes into existence, around 1797, around the time of Rousseau's Confessions, which Coetzee talks about. This idea of a kind of modern, reflective self wrangling with itself, different to the confessions of religious texts, a different self, a modern self, a more secular self. And you get some of we are doubtful whether the latter word be legitimate. It is not very usual in English to employ hybrid words, partly Saxon, partly Greek. So, like this one, geology as the autobiography of the earth. Charles Lyell, who of course was a huge influence on Dickens. Darwin. Why Dickens was in mind. Maybe it's Wilde, picture of Dorian Gray. We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography. And that's only, increased. I mean, our cultural forms are profoundly autobiographical now. Roald Dahl, an autobiography, Roald Dahl boy, I remember reading this book. An autobiography is a book a person writes about his own life, and it is usually full of all sorts of boring details. Autobiography as a concept came into existence at a specific moment, and it's related to a sort of, I suppose, in this definition, European modernity, a secular self. But then, the question immediately opens, and this is what Coetzee is wrangling with Rousseau, is, are we reliable sources of information on ourselves? Now, on the one hand, you'd say, of course, we are the definitive sources of information on ourselves. We are the experts on ourselves. If you think about biography, you often get the idea of an authorized biography and an unauthorized biography. Authorized biography is the person has allowed you special access. So one would think, authorized, authority, authorial, they're all related to each other. So on one hand, of course, we're the experts on our own life, aren't we? On the other hand, perhaps we're the least reliable people on ourselves. Perhaps we're the least reliable to interpret our own life. And this opens up a whole question around psychoanalysis, psychoanalytic thought, and, that moment where the insights of Freud's writings are permeating literary culture in the European metropole. So we think of Virginia Woolf. Now, Virginia Woolf, who wrote so beautifully and brilliantly on life writing and coined the term life writing. Why did she coin the term life writing? Because her father was the editor of the Dictionary of National Biography. There's an encyclopedia of long entries on important men of the 19th century and before. So a lot of what she's doing is in reaction against the great man idea of biography, the authorized. She talks about looking at thick biographies on the shelf and her heart just sinking, just thinking you're not going to get anything of what the person was actually like from this massive tome. And she and her artistic sort of comrades are trying to evolve a form of writing about lives that is very different, that is ironic, that is aware about self-mythologization, trying to pop that kind of bubble. Lytton Strachey is eminent Victorians. He starts writing ironically about heroic Victorians like Florence Nightingale, and in a local echo of this, William Plumer, who was a South African who actually ended up being very close to Woolf and the Bloomsbury set, while all these sort of huge tomes were coming out about Cecil Rhodes after his death, he wrote a very short, ironic, sarcastic little biography of Rhodes. It's a great read. He was a brilliant writer, Plumer. And he says, as a character put faithfully in a novel, Rhodes might impress, but would no doubt fail to convince the reviewers. They would complain that a character must develop, and it is perhaps difficult to find traces of real development. So Woolf was interested in not the definitive life, but the way we change throughout our life. She said a beautiful line, a good biography is the record of things that change rather of a good biography is the record of things that change rather than of the things that happen. It's not about events, it's about a slow metamorphosis of the psyche. And actually, this is a line that Mark Professor quotes in his biography of Mbeki, where he said that Woolf was the person who inspired him with her biographical thinking. And of course, this is all working through the insights of psychoanalytic theory. So, psychoanalysis has been very important for literary studies. In fact, sometimes I think it's more important for literary studies nowadays than it is for psychology. Because when someone goes to therapy, and they sit, well, it depends how strict it is, they either sit on the couch and look at the therapist, or they lie on the couch and don't look at the therapist, and they tell the story from their life. They just start speaking about their life. And the therapist or the analyst listens, but is listening in a particular way. They're not listening as if the person is an expert or sincere or truthful. They're listening for silences, for obsessions, compulsions, for gaps, for mistakes, for Freudian slips of the tongue, where suddenly the unconscious comes out. So, if we take psychoanalytic theory seriously, then we're no longer the experts on our own life. And in fact, there are aspects of our own life that we will never be able to see, like the back of our own head. And these come from questions of what Freud called transference, how our whole lives, in a sense, are determined by very, very early relations in our life that we can't even consciously remember, but in a sense shape how we relate to figures throughout our life. And the process of analysis is to try and understand these structures so that we don't get trapped in them. He explored aspects of childhood amnesia, of screen memories, of recollections that may actually be false because they are screening a memory of deeper emotional significance or trauma. And as I said before, looking at how subjectivity and identity comes into being and memory comes into being at a certain age, around 3 or 4, that's intimately associated with coming into language. So, yeah, this is what we do as in literary studies. When we read books, unfortunately, we can't just read them for pure enjoyment. We sort of read them half skeptically for what they're not saying, as well as what they are saying, for what they might be revealing against their better judgment, for what they might be betraying about themselves. And so, that's why I think life writing is a nice holding category, which comes from Woolf. So, yeah. Is a true autobiography even possible? Orwell and Dostoevsky said, no, it's just impossible, because you can never tell the truth about yourself, because there's certain things that you will never tell. Orwell said an autobiography is impossible really because seen from the inside, a life is a sequence of humiliations and disgraces too awful to control. Which is a line I often think about. All right. Of course, life writing doesn't get to non-linguistic, non-verbal forms self-expression, of which the self-portrait is a very well-known one. It's Lucian Freud. Continue the Freud connection. It's Nelly Mahoney's photographs, which are playing all kinds of interesting games with conventions of representation and race, gender, and sexuality. Of course, a self-portrait, a single self-portrait doesn't have what a written autobiography has, which is an unfolding in time, which is, in a sense, part of what makes narrative so mesmerizing, is that it's about what we do with time, how we understand time. But of course, one can do sequences, and this was a very affecting project by an artist called William Mutu, in which he basically did a series of self-portraits, and there are many more over a period of his adult life as he succumbed to Alzheimer's. So it's a sort of very affecting reckoning. That one of my favorite non-verbal autobiographies actually comes from Ivan Vladislavich's Portrait of Keys, which is in one sense a portrait of Johannesburg, but it's a lot of it's about art and sculpture. He's also a very sort of interesting art critic, and he starts by talking about a Japanese sculptor who has a piece called A Collection of End Bits of Lead from a Mechanical Pencil. It's a bowl of, when you have those mechanical pencils, they eventually get to the point where they can't hold the lead anymore. And then once he takes those tiny little pieces of lead and puts them in a bowl. Or that, at least that's what he says, he could have just broken them all up immediately. So there's always a sort of, do we believe the conceit behind it? Anyway, Vladislavich is not only a great writer, but also a very important editor in South African letters. He's often edited many of the most important non-fiction texts that have been published over the last decades. He says he thinks of it in mind of his own sculpture, which is called Autobiography, which is of a shallow box containing 392 pencil stubs. Because as he works as an editor and a writer, he uses pencils and wears them down, then he puts them, he sharpens them, then he puts them in a joint of bamboo that he finds in his garden, so he can use them till they're very, very short, and then when he can no longer use them, he puts them in this glass sort of bowl, and there's this beautiful archive of pencil, and he talks about the black and the red of the Stadler and the Faber-Castell, and it's this whole archive of work that he's done, but it's sort of indirect autobiography. So, but for now, let's go back to autobiography as writing. Of course, what this shows is that writing can actually absorb anything back into itself. You can have a different kind of genre of autobiography. You could have an album. You could have a symphony. You could have a painting or sculpture. But writing can always, writing can just ingest it, and that's what he's done. He's sort of produced it on the page again. So, moving then into what actually are we talking about when we talk about written autobiography, now that we're narrowing it down. Let me do an experiment with you. I'd like you to just read this. Before the flight, I was invited for lunch at a London club with a billionaire I'd been promised had liberal credentials. Yada, 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 yada. Is this an autobiography? Or is this a novel? Is there anything that's making you think, one way or the other, whether this is, so to speak, an actual story or a novel, something invented? Does anyone want to take a guess? What about this one? I was not sorry when my brother died, nor am I apologizing for my callousness, as you may define it, my lack of feeling. For it is not that at all. I feel many things these days, much more than I was able to feel in the days when I was young and my brother died. And there are reasons for this more than the mere consequence of age. I'll do one more. I've never known why we, my brother, sister, and I, were taken to the country when I was 5. So I suppose the question I'm asking is, if you just get a page written in the first person, is there any way you can tell whether it's autobiographical or not?
Is biographical an option? It seems that it's about the billionaire, not about him.
Okay. True. It could be a biography where the I is present. Nothing to stop it being that.
Fiction.
You say fiction. Is there any? What's giving you the aura of fictionality about this?
Sounds like the beginning of a good story.
The way it flows. Sounds like the beginning of a good story. Okay, yeah. The way it flows, there's something very expert about, which seems to imply that maybe, it's a province of a very skilled writer, novelist, whereas, autobiographies, maybe they can be written by amateurs and be a bit more funky. Perhaps. Any other?
There's no emotion in this.
Okay. So what does that make you think?
Story of events rather than attitudes.
Okay. It's a very flat tone, very affectless. This one is more about emotion. It's a famous beginning. I was not sorry when my brother died. It's flat, but nor am I apologizing for my callousness. And then the third one, quite a neutral. I've never known why we, my brother, sister, and I were taken to the country when I was 5.
It's very plaintive.
Very plaintive. It is plaintive. And look at the different I's in the sentence. I have never known why we, my brother, sister, and I were taken to the country when I was 5. What you always have in autobiography is the I of writing and the I in the past. And it's a dance between what times are these I's inhabiting? Anyway, I'll stop messing around with you, because actually there's no way you can tell. Because a novel can mimic any technique of autobiography, and it often does. So there are many, many, many novels that are written as autobiographies, but and some of the most famous prototypical English novels are Robinson Crusoe, for example. I was born in New York in 1632. The whole novel comes into being from impersonating nonfiction, by pretending it's a form of nonfiction. So I would say that perhaps there's almost no way, if you're just given a page of first-person narrative, there's no way of telling whether it is autobiographical or whether it's simply a novel written in the first person. And so this made a Frenchman called Philippe Lejeune outlined something that he called the autobiographical pact. He said that the only way something becomes an autobiography is for the I in the text to be identical with and coterminous with the I, the proper noun on the title page. Okay. So if we're entering into an autobiography, we're entering into a pact that the I on the page is identical with the proper noun on the title page or the cover page. So you have to go beyond the first page to get that confirmation. Now that might sound very obvious and banal, but actually when you start looking at how people play with that, things get quite interesting. So this one, I've never known why we, my brother, sister, and I were taken to the country when I was 5. That's the opening of Eskamp down 2nd Avenue. Let me say a straight autobiography, to use that rather dangerous word. A sort of a pretty standard autobiography, South African classic. He writes it from Nigeria because he's left the country. He tried to be a teacher, but his protest against Bantu education basically ends his career, and he goes to Nigeria and starts to reflect on his South African years. So he's reflecting at great distance, both temporally and spatially. So that's perhaps why there's this plaintive sense of looking back and understanding the story that brought him to where he is. Beautiful book, down 2nd Avenue. This, I was not sorry when my brother died. The first line of Titi Dangaremba's Nervous Conditions, of course the title is drawn from Frans Fanon, and the I in this book is not, we eventually get the fact that she's not, it's a different name. Okay, so this is, it reads exactly like autobiography. It feels very autobiographical, but it's a first-person novel. We can say it's an autobiographical novel. We can say that it's a Bildungsroman, it's a coming-of-age novel. It's about going to school. It's about coming of age, but you know, it's often been interpreted as a post-colonial and feminist Bildungsroman, which is to say, a bit like in Mpahlele's as well, that while the Bildungsroman in its initial context, which is Germany, 19th century Germany, is about generally a man who comes of age and takes his appointed place as a professional in his own society. These novels, like so many literatures from our country and other parts of the world that have undergone complex histories, are about disrupted Bildungsromans, where Mphahlele trains to be a teacher, but he can't take up his place within South Africa. He has to leave. A lot of this book is about the narrator's resentment that it's her brother who gets sent to school rather than her. So there's a sort of feminist element to it as well. The third example I gave to you, now this is something stranger, because this is this kind of book that's all the rage these days. Karl Ove Knausgård, the Norwegian author, wrote this huge cycle called My Struggle, where it's in the first person. The I is equal to Rachel Cusk or Karl Ove, but it's not really an autobiography. So it's a sort of halfway between an autobiography and a first-person novel, in the sense that it would be, I think Portrait with Keys is also like this, because if you read Portrait with Keys by Ivan Vladislavich, it seems like it's very real and autobiographical, and he talks a lot about his brother, Branko, and in the book, Branko, they often meet for coffee in Johannesburg, and Branko's kind of a bit more conservative, sometimes a little bit racist. He's a bit of a foil to the narrator. And then after I'd read that book, I realized Ivan Vladislavich doesn't have a brother called Branko. And you know, my sense is that no matter how many times I'm teaching a class of postgrads and they're all very postmodern and saying, oh, well, you know, there's no such thing as the real, and then you tell them that, they always look upset. So I think we invest in pacts about what we believe the author is telling us. And they can be messed with, they can be played with, they can be broken, but that is we think we're entering into a pact. This is a very interesting book, because the way this book works, and it was interesting to hear someone describe it as a biography, is that the narrator, the whole book is structured by her interactions with other people. And all that gets described as the other person, and in a sense, the only portrait you get of the I is through that reflection, you know, and almost as if you have to fill in the pieces, and you gradually realize they're actually all versions of her own life. So it's extremely realistic, it's extremely autobiographical, and yet it's also a very complex metafictional experiment, you know. So there's all kinds of strange autobiographical strains. It doesn't matter if you have to identify them in the form. I'm just trying to show you how the I can be stretched, and how this sort of pact between the I and the proper noun can be played with in this kind of writing. If we go to Paswani Mpe's Welcome to Our Hillbrow, wonderful novel of the South African transition, it's basically autobiography written in the second person. And we do talk about ourselves in the second person sometimes, don't we? Especially when you're upset. Look at yourself. You're an idiot. You're such an idiot. You, when you see yourself as a you, what does that do? The you, there's many novels written in the first person, and there's many novels written in the third person. So there's many novels written in I, there's many novels written in he, she, but there's very few written in you. It's very rare and I would say, going back to that metaphor of the particle, the you is a very unstable particle. If you write something in you, it's very, I don't know, it's very confrontational sometimes, it's very in your face. It's also sort of addressing the reader a lot. It's also interesting that halfway down the page, if you are coming from the city centre, going into that strain where you give directions, you go left, you go right, you go, you know. So what does it mean when you write an autobiography in the second person? And I often give this exercise to students. I ask them to write something from their own life in the first person, then they transpose it into the second person. It's suddenly a radically different piece of writing. All you've done is change a pronoun. But something mysterious happens.
Sorry, Hedley?
Yes.
Why does Coetzee write Boyhood?
I'll finish this and then I'll take some questions for 10 minutes. But indeed, then we get autobiography in the third person, which is what I'm going to be looking at as well with that excerpt from Boyhood. Coetzee, when he comes to write about his own life, he doesn't write, he writes a lot of novels using I, but when it comes to write about his own life in boyhood and youth and summertime, it's third person. And tomorrow I'm going to explore that more carefully why he might be doing it. But he calls this autobiography, i.e. from the French, autre means other. So looking at your young self as a stranger. You know, are we the same people we once were? I mean, all our selves have been replaced. What is the relation between that young stranger in the past, the autre, the other? So he coins this autobiography, and you know, what is their relationship? I dug this picture of him smiling. It's very rare. But, is it I and I? Is it you and I? Is it he and I? He's gone for he and I. All right, I've got. I'll carry on with my two other propositions, which is about autobiography and confession, and autobiography and political testament tomorrow. But I believe there's supposed to be questions, so yeah, let's just have the last 10 minutes.
I'm surprised you haven't used the term memoir. I just wondered if you could just say a word about memoir. My understanding is that it's an autobiography implies the sort of truth. Memoir to me is a bit looser. I'd love to hear you.
I remember when Binyavanga Wainana came to speak to us. He died last year, great writer, and he said that memoir always made him think of tweed jackets with elbow pads on. By which I think he meant, and I think maybe what he was driving at, I think memoir, to me, comes from a point of quite stability. Looking back, you know, that someone writes a memoir where they have a certain measure of maybe prestige, maybe financial stability, maybe privilege. It has the sense of sort of emotion recollected in tranquility, you know, to quote Wordsworth on poetry, that it's, again, it doesn't really matter trying to identify what exactly each genre is, but I find memoir, for example, you know, when I'm going to get to the question of what Toni Morrison talks about, where she says that so much of her literary canon is autobiography because it's about slave narrative, it's about abolition. That, to me, memoir doesn't fit with those writings because it's not a sort of leisured and expansive reflection on the self, which I think memoir connotes. She talks about how those writers, like Olade Equiano, like Frederick Douglass, they're at pains, in a sense, to suppress their personality because they don't want their works to be dismissed as self-indulgent or over-emotional because they're trying to get a message across. So in a sense, I think that memoir to me has a sort of a kind of ease and expansiveness that is perhaps, maybe this is overstating it, but it's coming from a place that's not so politically charged or constrained. You know, that there's a slight more spaciousness. I don't know. That's how I sort of think about it. But I don't think that necessarily holds for.
Why would anybody write it?
Why? Yeah. Why would anyone write an autobiography? Yeah. I mean, I think there could be as many. The reasons are manifold. It could be obviously for money if you're a celebrity, and sports autobiographies are the biggest selling books in South Africa. You know, so there's certainly a financial reason. But if one's not a celebrity or not a